Well, we've been going through a series on kind of spring and renewal in your life, and we've looked about renewing your personal life and within our church, within the community, with our nation. And I was listening to some of the things that I've been talking about, and because I was trying to take a nap, and it puts me to sleep when I listen to my sermons sometimes. Oh. And I realized, I just need to bring it simple today. There's sometimes you just need to hear it straight. And so that's what I'm going to talk today. I heard a story told recently about two guys that were from Louisiana, and they were coming back from one of the Final Four. Louisiana didn't do very good in basketball this year. And their names was Zellmeyer and Ewell, all right? And they were coming back from the game, and Zellmeyer stopped at this little barbecue place, and he went in and got him a little sack of boudin balls. Do you know what a boudin ball is? It looks like a big old hush puppy. It's fried and it's good. And they got out to the car, and Ewell said, "Zellmeyer, give me one of those boudin balls." And Zellmeyer said, "Nope, they're mine." And he said, "Come on, Zellmeyer, just give me one of them balls." And Zellmeyer said, "I tell you what, if you can guess how many I got in this sack, I'll give you both of them." And Ewell said, "3." And so today I want to give a message that both Zellmeyer and Ewell would get. It's as simple as you can get. It's talking about renewing your life, the three dimensions of a renewed life. That's it. And Jesus was asked a question one day in Matthew 22, verse 34. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they got together amongst themselves, even though they don't like each other. But they didn't like Jesus more. And one of them was an expert in the law. In the Greek, that means X is unknown and spurts to drip under pressure. Not really, it just said that. And one of them was an expert in the Old Testament, and he tested Jesus with a question. He said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" You might think, well, that's the Ten Commandments. I don't know. It's not just the Ten Commandments, a lot of laws. Which is the greatest? And Jesus replied, he said, well, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And then he gave another one. He said, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Our Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us to hear your word and do it. In Jesus' name, amen. So he was asked, which is the greatest commandments? If you had to list them, they're actually in the Old Testament, there's 613 commandments. They had all kinds of them. Some were big ones like thou shalt not commit murder. Some of them were not so big. It talked about how you to cook a goat. There was a law on how you should boil a goat. That's not a very common or important law. That was a lightweight law. Commandment, but they had divided them up. There were 365 positive commandments, kind of like 365 days in the year, I guess. And then there were 248 negative commandments. And so all those together lined up to 613. Jesus' answer was the most popular one in the Old Testament. It's called the Shema, was the word for it, they called in Hebrew. And it was, the love the Lord your God with all your heart. It was, Hear, O Israel, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, with all your strength. That was the Shema. It was very popular. People put it in their doors. People put it in frames. Today, if it was the same kind of thing, people would probably tattoo it on your arm. You got any tattoos? Anyway, they would have used that one. Love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. And people would agree, yep, that's the most important one. But then Jesus adds another one that is in a different place in the Old Testament, is Leviticus 19:18, which says, "Do not seek revenge against or bear a grudge against anybody or your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." And these two never went together before. People would never have put them together. The genius of Jesus is he saw it simple. He saw this is what all of the 613 laws are about. Love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. In fact, there's been many sermons about this. Martin Luther King did a famous sermon about it in 1954, which he got a lot of that from Phillips Brooks, who wrote a sermon about it in 1881. And in both those sermons, they looked at these texts, and I'm going to look at them in a little different way, but similar. Some of y'all are good at building things with your hands, and you know one of the things you have to do is be good at measuring. And so in a real way, if you look at this message today, we could look at it in three dimensions. First, the length of life. By length, I'm not talking about how old you are, but I'm talking about your inward drive toward what you dream of becoming. And if you're not dead, you're still moving forward. That's true. God's got a plan. You're slower, but you're moving forward. And God's got a plan for your life. He wants you to do something. And then there's the breadth. There's the outward drive to help other people. You do something that helps others, because you can become self-centered. It's real easy to do and just always focus on yourself. But you're supposed to love yourself and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the height dimension, which is the upward drive to worship God. So length, breadth, and height. That's got all three dimensions of following God together in these verses. And so that's what I want to focus on today. First, I want to talk about loving yourself. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's the length of your life, that you're supposed to be okay with yourself. To love, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. How can you love your neighbor if you don't even like yourself? And we live in a world today where a lot of people don't like themselves, much less love themselves. Some people love themselves too much. It's always about them. There was a Jewish rabbi, Joshua Liebman, who wrote a book called Love Yourself Properly. And so there's a right way to think about yourself, to have a healthy self-image so then you can help others. He said, how you get along with others at work, your aspirations, your performance at work, your talent, your abilities are all controlled by your self-image. How do you think about yourself? Sometimes we get negative labels when we're growing up. Sometimes they're not very accurate. They might say, oh, he's got a short fuse. Or they might say, she gives up too easy. Or she's a perfectionist. Or he is irresponsible. And you get these labels put on you, and they're not always accurate. And so you don't need to just hear what other people say, but what God has a plan for your life. There have been people who have been great successes, even though they had some negative feedback. Walt Disney was told by his art instructor that he was not very creative. He did pretty good. At his first performance at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Elvis was told by the concert manager that he was better off going back to Memphis and driving trucks, which was his current job. J.K. Rowling got fired because at her work every day, she would write stories on her computer. She ended up doing pretty good. Steven Spielberg was rejected twice by the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. They wouldn't let him in the school. Today, there's a huge building in honor of Spielberg at the school. Lucille Ball was told she didn't have any acting skills and she should try something different. But I Love Lucy was pretty good, wasn't it? Winston Churchill failed the 6th grade. He went on to become one of the greatest prime ministers in the history of England. The common denominator in each of these successful people was that they chose to remove that negative label they had and keep on going in life because God had a plan for their lives. I don't know what yours is, but sometimes you need to say, look, I don't care what other people said. This is where I feel the God's leading me and the gifts that I have. Now, the opposite side, you shouldn't overassess your gifts and come to think that you're all that. When I was in seminary, I had one class I took. It was a church history class, and at the beginning of every week, we had a pop quiz over what we had read. And you just read all this stuff, and then you took the quiz. It was 10 questions, fill in the blank. And I had a girl sitting next to me, Shirley Smith. She would ace it every week, 10 out of 10. And I would miss 2 or 3, and I was really frustrated. And so I said, how much do you study? She said, I'll read it, about an hour. And I was spending like 3 or 4 hours on it. So I redoubled my efforts because I realized that she had a better brain than I did. She did. She could read it one time and she got it. But that didn't make me feel bad because I also realized that she couldn't play the banjo. So there. You got gifts that are different than somebody else. Don't compare yourself to somebody else, but be what God has given you as far as your talents are. The cheapest car, one of the cheapest cars in America today is a Chevrolet Spark. It's a little car. It costs $13,600. My first car cost $500. But this one is $13,600, brand new. A Lincoln Navigator, the black label, costs about $106,000. But it's not fair to compare a Spark to a Navigator, is it? They have a little difference, few differences in the way that they drive and the way that they handle and they look. But a Chevy Spark can get in parking places that a Navigator can't. If you don't have a lot of money, Chevy Spark could probably get you where you want to go a whole lot cheaper. And so you got to accept what God has given you, the gifts that you've been given. Maybe you have some gifts and you don't have others. That's okay. You got to love yourself for what God has given to you. There's a poem that says, if you can't be a pine on the top of a hill, be a scrub in the valley. But be the best little scrub on that side of the hill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. If it isn't by the size that you win or fail, be the best of whatever you are. If you do that, then you've mastered this dimension. But this is not the only dimension of your life. It's not just the length, it's also the breadth. Jesus said, love your neighbor. The second law, he says, like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so you're supposed to love other people. You're supposed to love them and treat them as you'd want to be treated. And there's been a lot of critique on this one by people that I don't view as really smart, but some people do. And some of the critique, George Bernard Shaw said, how do you love your neighbors yourself? Doesn't make sense because, for instance, what if you like one thing and you give your neighbor what you like? For instance, if you came to my house most morning for breakfast, what I like to eat is peanut butter and banana sandwich. Sometimes I put them on bagels and warm them up. That's my favorite thing to eat. And so if you came to my house on any morning, I might think, well, I want to love my neighbors myself, and so I'm going to give you a peanut butter banana sandwich. But maybe you have an allergy to peanuts. That wouldn't make sense. But, they're not looking at this. What Jesus is saying is give your neighbor what they would really appreciate, just like you really appreciate it. And another critique is, well, how do you know what your neighbor likes? I mean, have you ever gotten your grandkids something or your children something, and you thought they'd really love it, and they open it up, and they never played with it again because they didn't like it? I've been married to Sharon for a brief moment. And there are times I get her something for her birthday, and she says, I think this is what you like, not what I like. Because I make a mistake. But you need to understand what they like, and you can talk to them, ask them questions, get to know them. and treat your neighbor in the right way. You know, loving your neighbor is not just the person who lives next door to you, it's the people who you come in contact with. We have a ministry to the J1 students here in town. J1 is a visa that you get when you come here and work in America for a short period of time. We have lots of people that come into our town that work in the summers, in the spring and the summers, and leave in the fall. And they come from all over the world, and they stay in hotels around here. And so we have a ministry. We have at Pineapple Inn, which is a hotel on Jamestown Road. And we went there last spring, and we had a meal prepared for them. It was hot dogs, American hot dogs, and all kinds of fruit and desserts and junk food, okay? And we go there, and we have this, where they are staying, they're out by the pool, and we prepare a meal, and then we try to get to know some of these students and to, eventually share God with them. And so there was a person there last spring, and her name was Tina, and I noticed she was sitting a little apart from everybody else, and so I got my plate, and I sat down with her, and got to talking to her, and she was from Austria, and we had visited Austria a few years ago, and so I had that in common, and I started asking her about her family and her parents, and before I know it, she was crying. I have that effect on some people. She's just crying. And she said, "I'll be back in a minute." And so she went back to her room, and I kept eating. And when I got later on, about 10, 15 minutes, she came back, and she stopped crying. It turns out that was the very day she'd arrived from the airport. And she was feeling homesick. She missed her family. And everybody that was there, nobody was from Austria. She didn't know anybody. She didn't speak very clear English. Well, she was pretty good English, actually. But she didn't understand some of the other people who were there, and so she felt kind of nervous. And so when she came back out, I said, "Listen, I want you to talk to Sharon, because my wife is really nice." And they did. Sharon bonded with Tina, and she got to know her, and she came several days to Pineapple Inn over the next few weeks. And in about a week, she found out that Tina needed a pair of black pants and a white shirt. She didn't have a car, so she needed that. And so Sharon took her to Belk's and got her a pair of black pants and a white shirt. And Tina was very surprised, and she said, "Why are you helping me?" And Sharon said, "Well, I'm treating you like I would treat my daughter, or I'd want my daughter to be treated if she visited your country." What's that called? It's called being a neighbor. People want to be safe, loved, and feel important. And you can give that to people. God wants you to be neighborly to people, to treat them with respect and kindness. Because I don't care why somebody comes here to wait tables, we can still treat them with courtesy and respect and love and kindness. We ought to have a compassion radar that's always ready to step up and do something kind to somebody. There was this guy in one of the churches I pastored named Billy. Billy was one of the finest guys you ever meet. He was a bachelor, and but he was always helping people. He had a special compartment, I found out from his family later, in his wallet where he would put some money, and he would pray every week that God would allow someone to come into his life that was in need and he could help them. He'd been very successful with his life and his career. And so he died suddenly in his early 50s. And the funeral was packed, and we put microphones in the aisles. And during the funeral, we had a time where people could stand up and say just a word of how Billy served them and helped them in their lives. And one after one, people came to the microphone, and one lady got up, and she said, "My husband ran off on me and my family, our family. He just left us, and I was devastated. And Billy found out about it, and he asked to meet me at Starbucks. And I met him there, and all he did is just said, how are you doing? And she said, I was so upset. And she said, he never gave me any advice, but just listened to me when I was complaining and talking about how hard it was and all I was going through and how much struggling and how angry I was. And he said, Billy just took it all. At the end of it, he said, I'll be praying for you. And he gave me a side hug and he shook my hand. And when he shook my hand, he put something in my hand and then he left quickly. And I looked down and it was a $100 bill. And she said, I needed the money, but it was more than just the money. It was that he wanted to help me for no other reason. It's called loving your neighbor as yourself. And that's core to what it means to be a Christian. If you want to be a person that's just not all about yourself, you have to have a breadth in your life. You have to be doing things for others, reaching out. And so that's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. There was a verse in 1 John where the gospel writer John also wrote 1 John, and he says, whoever claims to love God yet hates his brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they've seen cannot love God whom they've not seen. Lots of people today, if you ask them in our country, if you're a Christian, they would say, yes, I believe in God. That doesn't make you a Christian. Not just believing in God. It makes turning your life over to him and repenting and then trying to live out what it means to be a Christian and helping others and being a neighbor. So those are two dimensions of life, the length of life, the breadth of life, helping others, and then the most important dimension, the height, that we're supposed to love God. Jesus said the greatest command was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That means your emotions, your feelings, your thoughts, and your actions. Do your actions show that you're a Christian? Are you living out your faith? Sometimes people affirm that God is real with their lips, but they deny the existence of God with their lives. Somebody put it this way, some people have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. They're so involved with so many things. Sometimes you can be so involved in church and you're not really loving the Lord. You just kind of go through the motions. You do this and that and doing a lot of things, but do you have a personal relationship with God? Do you love God? I'm here to tell you today, we need God. All of us that are here this morning. If you're watching online, you need God. We need God in our lives. We need to worship him, to lift him up, to love him. When you think of all the great things God does for us here at Easter, you think of the beauty that surrounds us in nature. All that's true, but the truth is we need to just love God because of who God is. There was a story about this. There was a girl who was coming into class. She was in seminary, Louisville, Kentucky, Southern Seminary, and she walked into class. It was a big class, about this many people in it. And she walked into class, and she was holding her hand up like this as she walked in. She was kind of dramatic, okay. And she sat down in the front, and so the professor was there, and he said, well, Julie, I can see you've got some news, don't you? She had an engagement ring on. And Julie says, yes, sir, I do. And he said, well, Julie, what's your news? She said, well, I'm getting married. And he said, who are you getting married to? She said, Jim, who was next to her there in class. And he said, well, isn't that great? And everybody applauded, And then he kind of put her on the spot. The professor saw this as a teaching moment. And he said, Julie, let me ask you an important question. Why, of all the men in the world, have you decided to marry Jim? And it kind of caught her unprepared. And so she thought quick, and she said, well, Jim is really smart. And the professor said, yes, Jim does make good grades in this class. But do you know that Joe over here is a straight A student? He was valedictorian of his college, and he makes straight A's in all the classes here at seminary. How come you're not going to marry Joe? And that really got her frustrated. And she was embarrassed, and she couldn't think of a good answer. And she said, well, Jim is a good athlete. And the professor said, yes, Jim is a good athlete. But do you know that Daryl back here was an All-American basketball star at Duke University? And why didn't you marry Daryl? And she was shaking her head, and he said, why did you marry Jim? She said, I married Jim because he's Jim. No reason, because she loved him. She was in love with him. That's the way we're supposed to love God, not for what he does for you. It's great if God blesses you. It's great if he answers your prayers with a yes sometimes, but sometimes he's not going to. And so you don't base your love of God on what he does for you or even the beauty he's created around you. It's just because of who God is. God has made us. We have a need to turn to God in your life. If you want to live a complete life, a renewed life, you have to love yourself, you have to love other people, and you have to love God. And it all goes together. Not just one, all different dimensions. Jesus, at the end of his ministry, he told this story, which kind of encapsulates all this. Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, when the Son of Man comes, that's him, when he comes back, in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on his right, and he put the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance. And the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And I was reminded, as I'm reading these verses, that when we had met with Tina, my wife and I, we asked her, is there anything you would like to do in America? And you know what she said? She'd like to get a hamburger. And I thought to myself, that's something I know a lot about. And we took her to what I think is the best hamburger place in town. Sharon helped her with some clothes. You know, to do actions to live out your faith, that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And often we don't do it, but we need to. Jesus said, when I was in prison, you came and visit me, and the righteous will answer him. And they said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger, invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you? And the king will reply, truly, I tell you, whenever you did it for the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. If you want to have a renewed life, don't make it just about yourself. Be God's hands and feet. Be the salt and the light in this world. That's what God's calling us to do. It's as simple as that. Love God, love yourself, and love your neighbor. Simple. Let's do it.